because that's what I was told.
Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Chodesh Tov. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to make my apologies to everyone now, but to Anna in particular, that I got double booked, so I'm going to have to make this introduction and then pass the Zoom over to Anna for her own presentation as well as moderating questions. Before Anna gets started, I just want to pre-invite everyone a month from now to Rosh Chodesh Nisan, when we'll be hearing from Shana, and then Rosh Chodesh Iyar a month after that, when we're going to be hearing from Shoshana Helfenbaum. If anyone is interested in presenting anything from Sivan and on, they're all open. So Nisan, Shana, Iyar, Shoshana, and then Sivan and on. Please let me know if you're interested, and we will find you a slot. If you've never done it before and you'd like to learn, I am sure we can find you someone who can teach you. Okay, so a quick bio for Anna, even though she is well known within our community, and I'm totally not just reading this off the internet.
Oh, no.
Anna received her PhD in Midrash and her MA in Ancient Judaism from the Jewish Theological Seminary. Her dissertation investigated the workings of Midrash, focusing on texts that mention individual women. She's taught university courses, both in person and online, probably more online in the last few years, and currently teaches at Tannenbaum Chat. She's a contributor to the green chumash that's over her shoulder, the Torah, a women's commentary. And one of the courses that Anna has been developing is Gender and Judaism. And I think all of that background is really important in understanding the topic that she's going to present us with tonight, Vashti, minor character or major icon. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This illustrious little chavruta here on the screen. I'm so happy you're all here. And hopefully I help bring some joy to your joyous introduction of this joyous month of Adar by looking at a character. Oh, I'm the host now. Okay. Looking at, oh, here comes more people. Looking at Vashti. So minor or major. And really what we're going to do is look at Vashti in Tanakh. We're going to look at Vashti in Midrash. Most of the Midrashim are actually in the Talmud. And then we are going to talk about the perspective on Vashti through the waves of feminism, really, of the last 150 years almost. Actually, we're going to do it in a slightly different order. And I think we're going to think we're going to judge, but hopefully in a nice way, which of these perspectives we feel comfortable with and what that could mean to us. So the idea is that we are learning text together. We're learning a little bit about modern Jewish history, specifically the feminist movement. And, you know, I hope that it has an opportunity for us to reflect on ourselves also, and to potentially enhance our understanding of Purim and our experience of reading the Megillah together in Shul in just a few weeks' time. All right, well, that's a lot to try to accomplish. We have, Jonathan, just before you go, there's another thing that comes on after us on this Zoom or on the Shul Zoom or?
Usually they warn me if there's something
Okay.
else. So
right.
If no strangers start showing up, you just keep going as long as you want.
All night. We're just gonna have a tikkun leil Vashti. No. I'll watch the time, and we'll end it, you know, by 8, if not a few minutes, 8:30. Sorry, if not a few minutes earlier, something like that. Okay. So I guess we should just go over to the good old screen sharing. We didn't practice this yet, so let's hope it's gonna work, and we'll see it together. That's not the right thing. Okay, I thought I had it open. Okay, guys, you're gonna have to bear with me for a second while I open up the, it's very unprofessional of me, I'm sorry. Just sing some Purim songs amongst yourself while I open
Misha. That's all I got.
Okay. Well, that's okay. That's a good cool ish there for all us Nashim on the. No, we have some men too, I'm sure. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry about this. See, I pretended that I such zooming around so often, but thank God we're often not zooming now. So
I'm just happy to hear that Vashti is going to be revived. I am a pro-Vashtiist.
well, we'll see. I might change your mind on this one. I hate to tell you. That's an interesting thing. I was thinking about it. Should we be all like sharing at first and try and see like, what word pops to your mind? Maybe we could do that while I'm doing this. What word pops to your mind? Shanna, I think you started us off. When I say
Defiant.
defiant. Okay. Anyone else want to share?
Short-lived.
Ah,
Short-lived. Yes, we're going to see there's not a heck of a lot of information about her, which is where Midrash comes in. Are we seeing the my slides now? Wonderful.
yes, we
I
are.
apologize for that. Okay, yeah, I tried to close the tab so I would look professional because I closed too many. Okay, so yeah, I was really thinking about how to phrase the title. Do I do major icon or minor character? Like, which do I do first, or one versus the other? So Shayna's coming in. She's admitted to us with a preconceived notion about trying to revive Vashti. We are certainly in a positive way. I'm assuming, Shayna, you meant?
Yes, I did.
Yes. So we are definitely going to see that perspective, and we're going to see how that relates to contemporary or modern, postmodern Jewish history. And then I think we're going to hopefully have enough tools at the end for each of us to make the decision on our own, whether she is minor or major, or maybe Shannon and I can end with a debate. No, no, we could do that next year, maybe. Shayna, let's book that in the calendar. We'll do a debate next year. All right. Just kidding. All right, so we're starting off because I like always having visuals and text and everything. Oh, someone has to turn off their sound, please. Okay. So, start off with a visual here from an illustrated Megillat Esther back from 1617. A picture of Vashti at her banquet. Here's Vashti in the middle at her banquet, and we're going to talk more about her banquet, in a moment. There we go. So first we have to say who is Vashti. As John said in the beginning, not a lot of material about her in the Megillah itself. And I thought it was worthwhile to review quickly, at least, the information we have about her in the Megillah, because so many of us have grown up with stories about Vashti that are really from Midrash and from commentary as opposed to the biblical story itself. And so it's always important for me to differentiate what comes from where, to understand where the text comes from. And then we'll have to evaluate, does it even matter at the end? Okay. I'm going to argue that it does matter for a number of different reasons. So first we're going to see Vashti in the Bible. What I have done, hopefully you'll trust my kind of cutting and pasting here. I've taken all of chapter 1 and I guess the first pasuk or two from chapter 2 and truncated it to try to only focus on the character of Vashti. Now it's difficult because she is a minor character. There's no question about it. So we really know about her because of her interactions or lack thereof with, in this case, Ahasuerus, with the king. So we're not really learning about her standalone. It would be wonderful if we had her like a soliloquy or something, or a monologue where she was just standing and telling us her feelings. We don't have any of that, but then again, we don't have a lot of that in the Tanakh altogether. It's not necessarily the style that we tend to see in Tanakh. All right, so let's start at the beginning. We know that she is the queen, and that she made a feast for the women at King Ahasuerus's palace. On the seventh day, when the king was exhilarated by drink, he instructed his servants to present Vashti before the king in the royal crown to flaunt her beauty before the nations and the ministers, for she was of beautiful appearance. Now, here is how it is in the Torah itself. I'm imagining that some of you have a different view of Vashti's appearance at this point and or her potential lack of clothing. We will see that in the Midrash, but it's important for us to... Oh, guys, can you see the screen? Yeah? Okay, fine. I just got a weird notification about that. Okay. So, but we don't have anything here about a lack of clothing. Okay? We will talk about that soon. We know that she refused. Shane already said the word defiant. So she refused. And this isn't just a wife refusing a husband. This is a woman, refusing an emperor. This is a big, big, big deal. The king was angry, very angry, and wanted to figure out what to do. So he spoke to his advisors as to how to handle that. And they how to handle her because she had done something wrong. Memuchan, who's the name of his kind of chief of staff, I guess at this point. This is a name that later on in other midrashim gets kind of conflated with Haman. Okay, he's not necessarily the same person when he's in the story in the Megillah, but it's kind of like one bad guy and another bad guy, and they're both right hand men to the king, and they tend to get conflated. So in other midrashim, it doesn't matter to our story right now, but the idea is that Memuchan knows that this is bad news, that there has been a defiant queen. Why so? Not only is she defiant to the king, but she is potentially a role model to all women, and that they would all then potentially be defiant to their husbands. And this would pose a danger to the patriarchal structure of ancient Persia. And so this must be stopped. Okay. I'm paraphrasing. You're, of course, welcome to look at the psukim in front of you. So the plan is that there will be a royal edict that Vashti must never again appear before King Ahasuerus. Now, again, you might be thinking that maybe he killed her. Maybe, but it doesn't say that in the text itself. Again, we see that in later Midrashim, but it says that she's never to appear again. And then everyone will hear, all the wives will hear how horrible the punishment would be if they would act in this way. And so they'll all be nice little wives and never defy their husbands. That was the advice that was given, and Ahasuerus accepted the. That's all we have from the Torah. That's the whole story of Vashti. So short, I was going to say short and sweet, but not sweet. Short, potentially, I guess, defiant, however you want to describe it.
You're not going to make them crazy.
A queen. Everything okay, guys? There's someone's got to turn off their volume. Bavakasha. And let me see. Okay, and sorry, I lost my train of thought. So defiant, a role model, a queen, made a banquet in the king's palace. Okay, that's really, and we know her name, which, by the way, we don't know the names of every woman in the Tanakh. So, and also, it probably serves as a good reminder here, although I'm sure everyone realizes, we're not talking about Jewish people here, right? We are talking about a foreign nation that maybe oppressors, we'll talk about that soon, or certainly descendants of oppressors of the Jewish people. We're talking about a foreign court, okay? Both Ahasuerus and Vashti, okay? So when we're talking about her being a role model, it's not like, oh, an Eishachal, like it's a role model to the other Persian women. Okay, and the idea is that there's a fear that she would act in that way, and therefore she is squashed by being banished forever. That's the whole story from the Bible. Okay, I'm calling it the Tanakh. I'm switching over to Bible now because what we're going to see is that Vashti, as a feminist figure as a feminist role model starts being promoted in that way by non-Jews, by Christians in the earliest waves, the first wave of feminism in the 19th century. So we start to see Vashti mentioned by two very prominent feminists who you might know from other circles, from other ways of hearing of them. One is Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course, most well known, I guess, for her, sorry, this little gray square, I'm sure, bouncing around on the side here. Okay, from her her literature, her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was a abolitionist, and usually often that went together with being a suffragette and a feminist, especially in that era for women in that position. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, in one of her writings, called Vashti's disobedience the first stand for women's rights. Okay, so this is a perspective that she had by reading the Bible standalone. You remember, even though I'm asking you not to, and I'm being careful not to, but when we hear the story of Esther, we very often hear it through a rabbinic or a midrashic lens, because we've been told often, even as children, all kinds of other tales and additions to the actual Purim story. As is presented in the Bible. Non-Jews don't have that. Non-Jews Christians especially, see the Bible.
Hearing aid, so if you'll talk to me, it's very noisy.
Hi guys, we're just going to turn off the your mics, please. So so when she saw the story, the very sparse story that we just studied together very quickly, the Harriet Beecher Stowe saw this as a first stand for women's rights, and I could see where she was driving at, where she was getting this. Similarly, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, very prominent suffragette and feminist in the early feminist movement, wrote that Vashti, added new glory to her day and generation. Speaking about role models, my goodness, by her disobedience. For resistance to tyrants, she says, is obedience to God. Really, she's taking this idea of resisting the emperor, happens to be her husband, is identifying him as a tyrant, which I'm not really sure that plays out so much in the rest of the story as it stands in the Bible, but nevertheless, she wanted to see her in that way and said that, yes, you know what? Vashti is this role model to us readers today, to us early feminists in the 19th century, because we want to appreciate, and many of these women were religious as well, to look at their history and say, where in our history can we have women who are role models for the hard work we're trying to do today for feminism and getting the women to be able to vote and things like that. This is in the United States. And so, in looking in the Bible, able to see Vashti that way as she's presented in that manner. All right, I see there's some things in the chat. I'm just going to see what this says. If I can mute someone, prologue, why do we get the whole? Oh, okay, good. So, all right, there's questions here in the beginning. All right. Hi, Shayna asked the question, if we hate Vashti, why do we see Memucan as a villain? Good question. Okay, so Memucan doesn't have to be a villain, but he could be an advisor. So I think that I truthfully, I didn't look too much into that, but Shayna asked why are we conflating, or why do Midrashim conflate Memucan with Haman if we're not necessarily saying that Memucan is a villain. And I would argue that they both are advisors to the king who play important roles in the story. And there is a midrashic principle of bricha mina animimut, or flight from anonymity. Sorry, it's hard for me to say that. And the idea is that very minor characters sometimes in the Bible are conflated with other characters in the Midrash in order to kind of give identification to minor characters and then have the whole story flow even more. So that was the one thing. Then Shayna also asked, why do we get the whole prologue about this story, about Vashti? And I would argue about the whole party that's happening with Achashverosh. And I don't know. I think that it's perhaps it's an opportunity. If you look at it, for instance, as a piece of literature, we need a catalyst to bring a nice Jewish girl into the palace. You know, the idea of why does Esther, well, we know what Esther, her importance as the story goes on, but we need her in the right place and the right time. Why else would she be in the right place and the right time unless there was a vacancy? And so I guess there has to be a reason for the vacancy. So maybe that could be a possible answer. I don't think there's a definitive answer to that question. That's a very good question. Okay. Other questions while I'm doing questions now, or should I continue? Anyway, you're free to put it in the chat and I will try to, being my own moderator here, I will try to remember to look in the chat, or if people want to speak up, if they have a really burning question, the group is still relatively small and I'd be happy to, you know, if you just want to say, excuse me, because I can't see everyone's face at this time and see my screen at the same time. So you have to make a little bit of noise if you want me to hear you, which I'm absolutely happy to do. All right, so what we were doing there is talking about these two non-Jewish but Christian feminists who looked at Vashti as a role model in having women assert themselves in positions of power or in locations of power to stand up for themselves and to stand up to make things right where they see a wrong, and that's why they see her as a role model. Now we're fast forwarding through history to the 20th century, to the second wave of feminism in the 60s, 70s, 80s, depending on how there's different scholars kind of end the second wave of feminism at slightly different times. But the idea is here, not only is there a new movement towards new kinds of legal and economic equality for women, especially in North America, but there is also this kind of new wave of feminism bleeds into Judaism. More often in the more liberal movements of Judaism, but felt to a certain extent within modern Orthodoxy too. So if women are deserving of equal pay and equal under the law and all kinds of things like that, then maybe they also are deserving of equality in religion. We feel this in certain liberal Christian movements and in Jewish movements as well. And it's at that time that we start seeing more of this discussion of Vashti, or the discussion of Vashti revised as a potential role model. I have here a quote from Michelle Landsberg, the Canadian Jewish feminist. I remember reading her regular columns in, I think it was the Toronto Star, and works for social justice and feminism and other causes. And as part of a larger essay, which I admit I haven't read, but I've got this quote from a number of different places, she says this: saving the Jewish people was important, but at the same time, Esther's whole submissive, secretive ways of being was the absolute archetype of 1950s womanhood. And she certainly would have said this with disdain in her voice. It repelled me, says Michelle Landsberg. I thought, hey, what's wrong with Vashti? She had dignity. She had self-respect. She said, I'm not going to dance for you and your pals. So we have really a similar idea taken up here by a Jewish author. We start to see this coming through in Jewish authors who really associate, though, with, again, liberal Judaism. I believe Michelle Landsberg identified as a Reconstructionist Jew. I'm not 100% sure. And again, I think that the approach of these women, who perhaps were obviously very smart and deep thinkers, but not as well versed in rabbinic thought or in, post-biblical Jewish thought also are going back to the original biblical text and combining that with their new ideas of feminism, coming to these kind of conclusions. We have here another article written by Rabbi Susan Schnur, yes, later than that even, in as late as 1988, and 1998, and I looked her up too. I believe she's a Reform rabbi, and she also has something to say about Vashti versus Esther, in this case, in terms of the practice of Purim-related rituals. She said, this Purim synagogue, count how many little girls dress up as Vashti. 0, just a guess. Like she's being kind of obnoxious, actually, the way her tone, well, maybe not obnoxious, but ask the little Esthers, who you'll see dressed up, why they aren't dressed up as little Vashtis. Write down their answers. Ask what Vashti did to make her so bad. My daughter's friends, who I guess are of the same age that she's reflecting on, generally replied that Vashti said no to the king. Okay, this is interesting, of course, we think about it. So very important in a #MeToo or post #MeToo time period when we are more careful about teaching our daughters to say no to authority figures, especially men. We tell our children, not just our daughters. In this case, Vashti said no to the king. And in that case, though, that made Vashti bad, according to these ideas. This is something that clearly drives our author crazy. And she says, well, to teach them a lesson, invite all those little Esthers back to your house on the next Rosh Chodesh event, okay, a time often traditionally reserved for celebrating women, much like we are doing today, a day late, and help them burn their old misguided answers in a big black cauldron. Well, there's a lot to unpack here about the idea of women and witches and avodah zarah potentially and Wiccanism. But what she's saying here is that perhaps as women, in her perspective, that we should be embracing Vashti as this kind of theme we've been building all along. And we should be teaching all of the girls that still want to be like Esther that they are wrong. And we should find ways to empower them in a different type of womanhood. Okay, so again, very much in line with already the old-fashioned thought of more than 100 years before, the same kind of idea of celebrating defiance. And I guess really the question is, do we celebrate defiance or do we celebrate the one who was defiant? Can we separate out the message sent from the actual role model herself? So what we're seeing here I would argue, at least from our Jewish authors, who certainly have an idea that Vashti is the bad guy in the story, whether they understand that directly from the story alone in the Bible, or they've had, some experience with some of the Midrashim that we're going to look at, whether as Midrash or as, stories that they heard when they were kids. What we have here is what I would call a reappropriation, right? So a reappropriation is the cultural process, I'm just reading on the screen in front of us, by which a group reclaims a word or artifact that was previously used in a disparaging way of that group, and then consciously transforms it in a way that empowers and uplifts the group. Now, you can probably all think of examples of this right now. Don't say them out loud. But the idea here is that some groups who are in the minority and who have had slurs or negative ideas attached to them in the past can somehow, there's an idea that within the last few decades at least, to take some of those slurs and to the word here is reappropriate them, embody them, and use them for the positive rather than the negative. So I would argue that's what seems to be happening here with at least our Jewish thinkers about Vashti. In terms of the Christian thinkers, we'll leave that aside for now. But from the Jewish thinkers, I think that is what's going on here. And then there's a question, though, is that appropriate? Like, is that the right thing to do? I mean, reappropriation, I think, certainly has been successful in different groups over the time to bring, empower and uplift and raise consciousness. But the question is that always appropriate? Is there a time and a place? Okay, and a topic, quite frankly. I see some more questions have come up. I'm going to the chat. Michelle Davin did Holy Blossom. Okay, I was wrong. Reform, not Reconstructionist. Anyone else having trouble with my audio? Move around a little bit. That could be the problem. I see that someone had, so I'm going to move closer to the screen, and hopefully that will help. So Shayna is comparing reappropriation to upcycling for ideas. You mean like upcycling furniture, like old furniture?
Yep.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. All right. So reappropriation is it? Well, actually, it's an interesting thing. Like, let's say you have, I don't know all the terminology, but let's say you had a really fancy, antique, important piece of furniture that was like worth a lot of money and had a heritage to it. But you decided that, it didn't really match your living room anymore. So would it be appropriate to, paint it white to go with your new stark modernist decor? Or should you leave it in its original state? And I think that there would be probably designers and experts that could argue it either way. Okay, so the question here is reappropriation. Is that always correct? Because in Judaism, we have a little something called tradition. Now, of course, you have to figure out how we're going to define tradition. Are we talking only biblical tradition, or are we talking about how tradition has continued since then through time, namely through rabbinic thought and rabbinic literature? But it's definitely something to be considered. In Judaism, considered very strongly, I would argue. But the question is, how much do we have to consider tradition? Because even though tradition is tremendously important, we all know, whether Judaism wants to admit it or not, even within Orthodoxy, that we do evolve and change. Not completely, we still hang on to tradition, but we still do embrace, well, perhaps reluctantly or secretly embrace change. Okay, so the question is, though, of course, how far do we go? Because in Judaism, we've been talking so far, and I think probably everyone here knows this already, but it's worthwhile to say it out loud as a reminder. We had that story that was in the Megillah already, that was in the written Torah. But our tradition is not static within Judaism. We also have the oral Torah. So I have a little visual here in front of us that's not accurate, but on one side you'll see you have a Megillah scroll. So Megillah scroll is part of the Tanakh, which means it is part of the written Torah. And then we have just a page here of Gemara. It's not the right page. It has to do with Megillah, but it's the only one I could find to cut and paste. But it is, we have the oral Torah here represented by a page of the Talmud. So oral Torah, we use the word oral Torah or Torah Shebaal Peh or rabbinic thought or rabbinic ideas. All those are relatively synonymous, but the idea is here that we don't have one without the other. According to tradition, we always read the written Torah alongside, we don't read the oral Torah, we don't read the written Torah alone. We almost always read it together through the lens of and beside oral Torah. Best example of that would be, of course, as a kid, probably when you first studied Chumash, it probably was Chumash and Rashi, right? That most people do not study Chumash or Bible standalone. They almost always do it, with Rashi or some other commentary. This is a very ancient idea in Judaism. And so you could argue that it is potentially artificial, to have an understanding, and this I think could be argued, but you have potentially artificial to understand the story of Vashti or anything in the written Torah without also investigating what the rabbis in the oral Torah, as quoted in the oral Torah, have to say about her as well. So now we get to do Vashti in the Midrash. So this would be rabbinic ideas about Vashti. Again, some of these are going to be familiar because I've alluded to them already or because you've heard them in some manner, shape, or form. But I think it is important to point them out here. So first of all, what we can learn from two different parts of ideas about Vashti. I kind of took them in themes rather than where they're found in the actual text. So I have here the theme on this slide is Vashti's family tree. Where does she come from? Who is she other than the wife of Ahasuerus? So there are midrashim that supply that information for us, and it actually ends up telling us a lot about us and a lot about how the rabbis view the story and how the rabbis view Ahasuerus, and particularly that first chapter, Shana, that you asked about, gives a reason, perhaps, to tell us about the details that happen in the first chapter. So according to these midrashic understandings, Vashti is not just the queen, but she is royal blood herself. She is the granddaughter, or as some sources say, great-granddaughter of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is one of the ultimate original bad guys in Judaism for Jews. He's the one that destroyed the first temple. 586 BCE. So that is a huge deal. We, of course, know what it's like to live without a temple nowadays and how rabbinic Judaism has evolved. But back in those days, to destroy the temple was to destroy, it seemed like absolutely everything. They'd no experience of life, Jewish life, Israelite life, without a temple. And temple doesn't only mean a building. It means the way you communicate with God. So the destruction of the temple has each temples, but this is the first one, so many horrific ramifications. Also exile, not the first, but one of the first major exiles of the Jewish people, in this case to Babylon. And it is all because of Nebuchadnezzar. So if you see Nebuchadnezzar anywhere, you know that is bad news. So by associating her with him, that is demonstrating a huge blot on her character for the rabbis. The next bit of her family tree, I don't know, I think it reflects a little bit more on Ahasuerus actually than on her, and it is difficult to separate them out because their characters are so intertwined, but it just also points out that she is the one that has the noble blood, that her husband Ahasuerus she married him, and that he was only a stable boy, really, and in her father's extended royal household, and she married him and then brought him up into the royal status that he had. So I don't know. I suppose it's probably more disparaging of Ahasuerus, but it might be disparaging of her too because she only married a stable boy, even though she has royal blood. So that's your family tree. And now we have to talk about the party because the party is the main theme of chapter 1 where she is found. And now we have to talk about the party in connection to the temple, the same first temple in Jerusalem that we mentioned before, which the chronology is a little bit iffy on it, but probably existed 2 to 3 maybe generations before Vashti. That the rabbis have drawn a connection to what happened at the party to the destruction of the temple, which is a theme that they, cannot get away from because it was just so monumental. So, according to this midrashic idea in the Talmud, in Masechet Megillah, in the tractate that talks about a lot of the themes in the Megillah, it's called Megillah. There's a discussion here about the kelim, or vessels, that were used at the party. Kelim can just be vessels, but kelim, kind of like capital Kaf, even though there's no capitals in Hebrew, are the kelim, namely the holy utensils that were in the temple. Like, the golden menorah and the mizbech, like all of the things that were restricted only for temple use. And the idea is here, just like nowadays, there's always, circling ideas about, the Vatican has whatever the Vatican has, that they, in their basement, all the kind of things that maybe were from the Second Temple, the artifacts from the Second Temple. So too, there's this idea, this is from the First Temple, that the descendant, Vashti and her husband, had vessels that had belonged in the First Temple, and they were storing them away, I guess, in their basement, until they did some math. And there's some very complicated math before this this passage in the Talmud that tries to figure out if enough time has passed between the destruction of the temple and this party to reveal to Ahasuerus that in fact that Israel is not going to be redeemed, and God is not coming back for them and not going to rebuild their temple. Turns out the math was wrong, but that's how he believed it was. And so he thought now it was a free-for-all with these golden vessels that he had from the temple, and that he took them out and used them at the party. Then comes a very strange comment that's pretty difficult to figure out. Most later rabbis trying to figure out, weren't terribly successful at it. But the idea is here that Satan came to the party, because this is bad news if you're using the vessels of the Beit HaMikdash at a drinking party. This is the kind of place where Satan would be hanging out. That Satan came and danced among these horrible sinners that were doing these horrible things to these holy vessels, and that he killed Vashti. Well, Vashti still is talked about a little bit later on in the story. The timing of it does not work out exactly, but it's sending us a strong message here that Vashti is worthy of being killed by Satan. Again, it doesn't match so much with the story as it appears in the Bible itself, but I think that this midrash is really coming to demonstrate to us that Vashti, whose grandfather or great-grandfather destroyed the temple, then participated in a party where those vessels were used totally inappropriately, and was worthy of being visited by and killed by Satan. Okay, so this does not paint a good picture of Vashti. It paints a confusing picture, I agree, but it does not paint a positive picture. We have further discussion or emphasis or obsession about these temple vessels, that the idea that there's a verse actually which doesn't really talk so much about Vashti per se. It talks about all of the women of Persia, but one of the verses from chapter 18 that talks about there would be no end of humiliation and wrath, it's really as if all those women rebel, but the Midrash here takes it as Vashti alone, and it's saying, yeah, there should be no end of humiliation and wrath, towards Vashti, because It was her father that or father or grandfather or grandfather, depending on the version, who dishonored those original temple vessels by destroying the temple and taking all of that as booty. And so he was humiliating and filled with wrath for the Jewish people. So she is deserving of any humiliation and wrath that comes her way. So those are the associations, negative associations that are attributed to her based on the her association with her ancestors and the destruction of the temple. But it doesn't end there. At one point, Memuhan or Haman, depending on again the reading of the text, explains why Vashti is worth getting rid of. We already saw that from the text itself, it seems like he's recommending to Ahasuerus to get rid of her because, the way she acted and that she was uppity to her husband and disobeyed him, and he was afraid that all the other women of the nation, Persian nation, would act accordingly. So, but according to the Midrash, there's even more reasons why Memuhan would be interested in getting rid of her. And one sounds a little bit funny, actually. Don't forget, there's a lot of, potential here for maybe exaggeration or funniness. If we want to talk about it's really a whole other theme in terms of, Purim spiel. But in this particular case, she is described as slapping the king's um, slapping the king's advisor, namely Memucan, with her slippers on this side and that, like smacking him back and forth with her slipper, which sounds like a little bit like comic relief, but also displays, potential violent tendencies. And certainly this would not be seen as a positive trait in the Midrash by the rabbis. Then, as part of the punishment that is given to her, as described by the rabbis, a lot of ideas come out here, actually, that you might have heard of before. That Vashti, excuse me, this is the idea that's presented here in the Talmud, that she was brought out naked, not just to show her beauty, but actually with no clothes on. As we said, that's not in the text itself, but that's what's learned here. And it's learned here because of the rabbinic principle of midah keneged midah, or a measure that a man measures that he is measured. In this case, it's not a man, but it's a woman, which is basically like a kind of karma, I guess, where if someone is punished accordingly with in the same way to parallel the bad thing that they did, or the opposite is often true, the people are rewarded in a parallel way to the good thing that they did in the past. In this case, it's punished and it's bad things, and the idea is that she was punished by being brought out naked in a humiliating way, because according to this midrash, that Vashti would have Jewish female slaves or servants in her household, and she would make them do their household work naked in order to humiliate them. And she would make them work on Shabbat, which, and then this midrash goes on to continue to compare it, not only that, therefore, she's humiliated by being asked to come out naked, but also this happened to happen on a Shabbat. Not that that would have made so much of a difference to Ahasuerus or Vashti. They aren't Jewish, but in order to just show the kind of it comes full circle thing. And how do we know that the party happened on Shabbat? Because that verse begins with the phrase, and on the seventh day of the feast. So anytime you see seventh day in the Bible, of course, the rabbis are going to read into that it means on a Shabbat. Here, oh my gosh, this includes probably one of the funniest statements, I believe, in the Talmud, oh, I have to watch the time, that it reflects on the location of Vashti's feast. Remember, we saw that painting in the very beginning that Vashti had a feast. Her feast was in the royal house. And presumably, according to the rabbis, that's not a very theistic thing to do because there must have been a special place for the women and for the harem and things like that. But she decided to have her party not in the women's house, but in the royal house. And so presumably then it was there was mixed dancing or some kind of a mixed gender party. If not the party itself, then perhaps parties right beside each other. And that is seen as a negative on her. And there's a great saying, as you can read here at the end of this slide, there's a folk saying that says, this is in the Talmud, he with pumpkins and his wife with zucchinis. Well, you can make of that what you like, but what the rabbis understand from that is that they are the same, perhaps not exactly the same, maybe a little bit separate but equal here. And the idea is that if Ahasuerus is doing nasty, inappropriate things in his party, then Vashti is just having a party in the same house and doing the same as her husband and is conducting herself in that way. And of course, that would also be seen as a negative by the rabbis. Here's another famous painting of that banquet from Florence in the 1400s. Okay, so if we're saying that though Freudian slip there, that Vashti refused to go, you might say, oh, maybe Vashti's good then, because maybe it shows that she was modest and that she didn't want to go out naked. This is all building on the idea of the Midrash that he's asking her to come out naked. And maybe that shows a positive side about Vashti, which would actually stand in contrast to all these other ideas from the rabbis that we saw so far. So the rabbis here come save their day and say, no, we're painting a consistent picture of Vashti here. She didn't refuse because she thought it was correct and proper to refuse. She refused because she was embarrassed, because if she would have to show her body, she would show that there was something wrong with her body. And actually, we have two choices of what those things would be. According to Rabbi Yossi ben Bar Chanina, it says that she was struck with leprosy at that point. Leprosy is a physical ailment, but there's often a spiritual element to it as well. And that would have been horribly embarrassing to display her body filled with leprosy. And it's for that reason, not because she was inherently modest and ethical, but for that reason that she didn't go. And then another earlier source in a Bright I believe that's quoted here in the Talmud, it also says that the archangel Gabriel came and did kind of like a miracle and actually made her have a tail or other similar appendage, depending on the version that you see, that might hang between the legs. But the idea is here that Vashti was transformed into not the feminine proper woman or feminine body that she had before, and she was horribly embarrassed, and it was for that reason that she refused, not out of any inherent goodness or modesty. So we have a lot of midrashim there, and I guess I don't know if I was being even-handed or not, but I hope that I was able to demonstrate to you that all of those ideas were negative ideas about Vashti. Now, we could go on and talk about maybe those are later midrashim, and maybe that displays a misogynistic view of the rabbis, that they took a strong woman of the Bible and tried to transform her into this horribleness. You could go that way, and there have been writers that have. But the challenge is that we are Jews that have those stories in our history for at least the last 2,000 years. So how do we manage that as Jews? Sorry, someone's mic's on again. So there was just, I think I'm going to skip these ideas in the interest of time. I'm just going to come here to this idea of how do we deal with this? As traditional Jews today, we are always figuring out, I would argue, I would hope, that we are always trying to figure out how to balance tradition and modernity. And, I don't know how to do animation and stuff on these slides. I probably should. But here I make it look like it's a 50-50 equal. But we all know it's not. Remember, we talked about reappropriation before, and we talked about tradition, and we talked about making it meaningful for us, but also tradition. So, this idea of like a modern feminist idea versus tradition of 2,000 years of, rabbinic ideas that have permeated our very being as rabbinic Jews. How do we manage those potentially conflicting ideas? And you could even argue that sometimes this idea isn't only a Vashti problem, but the idea of trying to figure out how to balance, and I'm not saying it has to be 50-50, but some kind of balancing act between Torah and feminism. How do we manage that? And when we even say those words, what do we mean by that? When we say Torah, what kind of Torah are we talking about? Are we talking about only the Bible, like those Christian writers would have seen? Or are we talking about Torah writ large, which would involve all of those negative midrashic ideas as well? We're talking about feminism. What do we mean? Do we mean only following blindly previous feminists who may have not have had the experience of all of those years of tradition, of rabbinic tradition? Or do we mean to forge ahead and kind of come up with our own kind of feminism? I'm just going to share one idea here, which is from an article that I don't particularly love, but I really do enjoy this quote. Okay, so we have been talking all night long about Vashti, but what happened to poor Esther? The valorization of Vashti is especially insulting, according to this author, because it's not like the Jewish canon lacks worthy female icons for modern feminist audiences to embrace. Heck, he says there's even Queen Esther, another victim of sexual assault in the Purim story. Presumably, she gave over her body, with some willingness, but not excitement, to King Ahasuerus, but one who found the internal will to carry on and save the Jewish people. She had to endure a lot in order to be in the right place in the right time in order to do that. And then, unlike her predecessor Vashti, Esther not only defied her husband, she also actively manipulated him into executing his prime minister, rescinding a royal decree, and allowing her co-religionists to wage war against the king's very subjects. So if we look at those qualities, if we're talking about emphasizing strong women in the story of Purim, then perhaps we, I'm not going to stop you. I'm not going to say to get rid of Vashti, but the idea is, and I have a huge amount of respect for, the women and thinkers who have come before me, who've really tried to find their place and their role models in the story, and who have tried to emphasize little known biblical characters and bring them to the forefront. I'm all for that. But in this particular instance, this little known character is not even a Jewish character. We do have other positive characters who aren't initially Jewish in the Bible that we can see as role models. We've just read about one in the last few weeks in the Parshiot of Yitro, right? Who's Moshe's not Jewish father-in-law, and yet we have so much to learn from him. But in this case, we have a non-Jewish queen, who, stood up for herself in the Bible. But according to at least 2,000 years of tradition, we have other aspects of her that have become, I would argue, part of our DNA, part of our Jewish DNA, to see Vashti not as a standalone the way she is in the Bible, but to see how all of our ancestors who, and it's us today, who listen to the story of Purim and Shul. And even though we hear only the Pshat, only the text of the Megillah, in our minds and in our hearts, we're often hearing these other, or feeling these other ideas too that are part of these commentaries that we have been exposed to. And I'm not sure that we should negate those ideas. And so if that's the case, then maybe Vashti should not be the role model. But that doesn't mean, as our last slide said, it doesn't mean that Esther's only a sweet little princess that you dress up your little girl in her party dress and put a crown on her head. But that's not Esther either. I mean, maybe next year for Rosh Chodesh Adar, we can think about the complexities of Esther and the complex leadership role that she plays, and potentially see her in her complexity and respect and honor, and be excited about that as well. Question? Anyone? 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 Okay, I went a minute over. Sorry, guys. Anytime. Oh, there's a hand up. Debbie. Debbie, is your hand up? Oh, and you're
Just
you're
clapping. It's a
clapping.
great,
Okay,
great presentation.
I'll
Thank
take
you.
it. I'll take it. All right, well,
Jonathan had to leave. It's Emma. Hi,
yes.
my
Hi.
camera's off because I'm lying in bed with my son while he's trying to sleep. Jonathan had to leave to an event, so he asked me if I could sign off and say thank you so much. It was so fascinating, really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank
And looking
you.
forward to the next one. And Chodesh Tov, everyone. Well, it's nearly finished, but have a wonderful weekend. See you all on Shabbat, hopefully. If not
Yes,
before.
lots of happiness for Adar and always.
Amen. Amen. Good
Okay.
night, everyone.
Good
Thank
night,
you so
everyone.
much.
Thanks for
Thank you.
coming.
Thanks, Anna.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming. Thanks for supporting such a great program at the school. Bye, everyone.